there have been Bitcoiners like Rizzo that have been inviting all this shitcoinery to Bitcoin. Like, all of that is already possible. The only thing that the core developers are now saying is, okay, all this stuff is now possible. Let's at least make it as least harmful as we can.
And now there's a formal VIP out there to soft fork the network.
You cannot stop somebody who is motivated and willing to pay for the block space from putting arbitrary data on the chain.
I think we're going to have a fork, but it's going to be just a joke.
So now gloves are off and we're fighting.
Book reminder, nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investment or product. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions the company sponsors or projects discussed. Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian on X here with another great podcast for you today. We've got a roundtable discussion, chaos in Bitcoin land as a fork proposal descends out of the midnight ethos or ether to rock the Bitcoin world. So this roundtable discussion is going to be about the recent BIP 444 emergency soft fork proposal. One that has generated no shortage of controversy and that could, if pushed to its fruition, perhaps fork the Bitcoin network, resulting in competing blockchains with competing coins. We've got Shinobi, technical editor at Bitcoin, a magazine, Joakim Book, researcher and editor out there in the Bitcoin space, will co-host today. And then we've got, last but not least, the legends, Aaron van Wirdum, author of the Genesis book. You can get that where their books are sold, on Amazon and other places. A deep dive into the history of Bitcoin and the cypherpunks who created it. BIP 444. Joakim, can you give us the TLDR?
TLDR, Bitcoiners aboard, and we really want to fight. So now gloves are off and we're fighting. This has been brewing for a while. Parts of the network wanted to run a competing implementation. Core launched its Core 30, expanding the operator limit by a lot, basically saying to the world, inviting in the shitcoinery that has been going on with inscriptions and ordinals and all kinds of other metadata, non-monetary transactions for a long time. The Oceans people, the Knots people saw this as a complete challenge, and now this is the only thing that we're talking about. And now there is a formal BIP out there to soft fork the network. We're joined by Aaron and Shinobi, who know a ton more about this than I do and are going to help me make sense of this.
Can I just jump in? I completely disagree with the premise there. To be clear,
tell me where I'm wrong. Like, explain to me, Aaron. You wrote an article a couple of weeks back about what this debate is about. So yeah, let's go.
Just to start off with this, there have been Bitcoiners like Rizzo that have been inviting all this shitcoinery to Bitcoin. They've been saying this stuff, all this bullshit that's going on all these other chains. We want that on Bitcoin as well. There are people like Rizzo. These are out there. but they are now already here. So we got all the inscriptions nonsense. We got, like, all of that is already possible. The only thing that the core developers are now saying is, okay, all this stuff is now possible. Let's at least make it as least harmful as we can. So there's sort of two aspects to that. One is you've got layer 2 protocols like Citria. That's sort of the first example of that. They need a little bit more arbitrary data space than fits in an op return. So they were going to use fake pub keys. That's bad because that bloats the UTXO set for no good reason. That makes running nodes more expensive. So the core dev said, okay, let's increase it so they can use op return for that, which is less harmful. And then step 2 of that logic, I think, is, okay, if we're doing anything with this limit, let's just remove it altogether, because why not at this point? You got all this, you can already put anything in stuff like inscriptions. It's better if people put it in op return. They probably won't because it's cheaper to put it in inscriptions, but it's like, why not at this point? If they do want to put it in op return, that's better, because that means the blocks will be smaller in total because you don't get the witness discount. So it's a big why not. It's like an improvement to let layer 2 protocols like Citra do this, And then beyond that, it's just a why not. It doesn't do any extra harm. And if anything, it would reduce harm. So that's the premise I would disagree with.
I would go further than why not. It's an actively removing toxic incentives. Like the entire reason that Citria was going to, or is actually using fake pub keys rather than op return, is because their system design is a reactive protocol like Lightning. Like people have to actually monitor the network and see if old states or invalid transactions are submitted to the chain and then respond to that with another transaction. So like nothing would have prevented them from getting them into the block, but they also want maximal visibility as soon as possible across the network so that if anybody interacting with a BitVM based system sees an invalid transaction, they can respond with the transaction to penalize that immediately. And so like BitVM kind of demonstrated, like we hadn't really thought through like what types of systems and how complex can we build them on Bitcoin as it is right now. And this was just a demonstration that this filter in this whole design space of reactive, like challenge response protocols you can do off chain, like there could potentially be the need for a lot more data than something like Lightning. And if anybody designs a system like that that has that need in a reactive security protocol to ensure that those transactions are seen as fast as possible, if they're invalid in that protocol so people can respond to it, they're going to do things like fake pub keys because they want that quick visibility, not just getting it included in the chain. And like BitVM just definitively demonstrated, like we can't predict the future. Like you don't know what somebody is going to realize tomorrow they can build on Bitcoin and what the needs of those systems are going to be.
Or why are you inviting? What do you say to Luke and to Mechanic and all these other people who kind of reasonably are saying this isn't what Bitcoin's supposed to be?
I want to interject here and just talk about what we're talking about. This is all, nice table setting, but what we're talking about is a BIP here that was specifically kind of coded under like cloaked night circumstances, issued by, an anonymous author, but that very clearly is the work of some individuals who, as Joakim is saying, have a clear intent, right? What is that clear intent? And it says it right in the BIP, right? Is they have this idea that, let's just put it out there, right? That this is an emergency threat, right? That like the current Bitcoin blockchain is under an emergency threat, that node runners have an emergency, right? That like there needs to be some sort of, wartime measures given to the Bitcoin developers. So that, the soft forking process, the thing that we've been told should take years and years and years, and all this discussion to get totally perfect, should be rushed through because, and I quote, there are legal and moral risks now to node operators as a result of this. So I don't know. It's all well and good to talk about all of the technical reasons. There are valid technical reasons for these changes. But as Aaron said,
so some of these technical details are relevant for why they considered an emergency. So I've spent a lot of time, debating this with all kinds of people that are against this up return default setting change. And ultimately, the debate always ends in one of two places where I just have to say, okay, we'll just have to agree to disagree. One of these places is, as Joakim just pointed out, is that they will argue, this is inviting them. And if we're just mean to the spammers, then they will go away. I don't find that convincing because I don't think people like Rizzo or Udi or Eric, they're not going to go away if you're mean. They love it. They enjoy that stuff. They thrive on that. So I don't buy that argument. And then the other argument, and this gets to the soft work, is that Luke specifically is of the opinion that illegal data, and specifically CSAM, that is only real CSAM if it's in an up return. That is his opinion. So if it's in an if it's in an inscription or in any other part of a transaction, then it's non-CSAM and it doesn't count. So now, for the first time in his view, there's like an imminent threat that this stuff could end up in the blockchain. Again, I find that a baffling.
It already has.
multiple times.
You and I agree, but Luke is of the opinion that this is now for the first time possible for a reason that I cannot explain other than Luke logic. According to Luke logic, this is the first time this is possible. So now he wants to do an emergency soft fork to make this impossible. And yeah, some of the details of this emergency soft fork, and I would say in particular the activation mechanism, is pretty bizarre, and we can get into that. I don't know, maybe Shinobi, do you want to get into the details of the soft fork itself? That's maybe a good place for you.
I think the most important thing to point out here is that this would be a soft fork that would expire after roughly a year. So all of these restrictions would only be enforced for a predefined length of time. And after that, all of it would become unrestricted again, and users would have to fork again to kind of reenact those rules for another temporary period.
Wait, is that serious?
Yeah. So, and there you'll see why the proposal does that as I go through all the things that it's restricting. So first of all, any new script pub key, so the thing in the transaction output that actually defines how those coins are locked, that is larger than 34 bytes would be consensus invalid, unless op return is called first, in which case it would allow 83 bytes. Next, push data, which is anytime you actually put data on the stack in a script, like a public key to compare against, or a signature, or actual values like that, you're using push data. That pushes data in excess of 256 bytes is consensus invalid, except for BIP16 pay to script hash script sigs. And how that works is rather than having the whole script in the output, you just have a hash of it. And when you go to spend it, you actually have that push that puts the entire script on the stack to verify against the hash so that it wouldn't break that. Next, it makes spending any undefined witness versions or cap leaf versions. So like different versions of SegWit, the original fork is version 0. Taproot is version 1. And there's all these versions in the future that we can define with new features or script formats or whatever are invalid by consensus. So what this specifically would mean is all of the hooks in SegWit, in Taproot and TapScript that are designed to be used to upgrade and add new functionality in the future are all invalid. So all of those mechanisms to be able to upgrade Bitcoin with a soft fork are invalid with this fork. And upgrading any of these things in any way while this fork was active, or if the fork became permanent, would require a hard fork. None of these things would be soft forkable to upgrade ever again. Witness stacks with the Taproot annex. So this is kind of a place where you can commit to arbitrary data that was left as an extension of Taproot itself to be defined in the future, is completely invalid. So nobody can use that data field in the witness for whatever new functionality they want to add. Taproot control blocks, which is essentially the Merkle proof from the top of the Taproot script tree and down the path of whatever script you're using to prove that it's part of that Taproot tree, that is greater than 256 bytes. So that would be more than 128 ways to spend that UTXO are invalid. I don't think this would, I'm not sure if this would break the more modern versions of BitVM, but this would completely break anything deploying the original version of BitVM, the version 1. Tap scripts, including op success, which is another upgrade hook in Taproot that allows us to define new opcodes, is invalid. So again, it would be impossible if this was active or became permanent to ever add new script to the Taproot system ever again without a hard fork. And then the last restriction is any tap script in Taproot, executing using opIf or opNotIf is invalid. This could be worked around just because using different leaves in a Taproot tree could be the different, if branches, and you don't actually need to use that opcode. But Rob Hamilton actually verified that the miniscript compiler, which some wallets like Nunchuck, his Anchor Watch wallet, and others are starting to implement. By default, you can create Taproot scripts that do use opIf or not opIf, depending on how you actually compile them with miniscript. So this could actually have the potential of burning people's coins and making them unspendable while the fork is active. But
Yeah,
those
so people that own coins right now in some complicated way, they would not be able to spend it anymore, right? They would just lose their coins.
If they, depending on how the miniscript compiler that actually made the raw script did that and was configured, yes, it could.
Right.
Well,
So one point nuance real quick, because you say some of these things would not be possible with the hard fork. The caveat there, of course, is that at least in theory, it would expire automatically after a year. Now,
that's why they did that. That's why they have the expiry.
Yeah, the logical follow-up question, though, is like, if it's such an emergency, if it's such a big risk of what can now happen, why would that not be a risk in a year from now? Like that, I cannot wrap my head around, if it's such a big risk that CSAM can be uploaded, like why would that not be possible in a year?
Because you signal away. Like this entire thing is a virtue signaling story, right? Like you signal to all these bad actors that they need to get the hell out of here, right? So if successful, then they're no longer here and it's not a problem. So I mean, and that's the Hail Mary going on here. That's the hopeful things happening. But so like, and that's basically where I'm stuck too. Like up until 2 days ago, up until the dropping of this BIP whatsoever, it was basically a fun little adventure on the side of on the outskirts of Bitcoin, right? Like we were talking about it didn't matter. And Jameson Lobb famously in Lugano just a few days ago basically was just like, what are you going to do about it, right? And it's like, yeah, this is what we're going to do about it, apparently. But so like,
well, not really, because even under this soft fork, you can still upload arbitrary data onto the blockchain, as Peter Todd has shown, who uploaded the entire text of the BIP 444 into the blockchain using these new soft fork rules. So it would still be valid under these new software.
How much of this, Shinobi, explain to me, how much of this is just, I don't know, in the weed developers, highly technical people trolling each other on a high level? Like how much of this is like 5 people?
No, this is just clueless people starting from a completely broken premise to begin with. That illegal content is somehow magically more illegal or more of a risk to people based on how the bytes are arranged on someone's hard drive, which is just absolutely absurd. Like you can hide information, like one piece of information in another piece of information, like a picture. That doesn't magically make illegal information suddenly not illegal. Like encrypting information, which completely obfuscates what it even is, does not magically make illegal information legal. Like the entire premise is just fundamentally nonsensical and broken. And from that, they have like taken this argument that op return is somehow the most dangerous and the most illegal way to store illegal information. And are now, like, as you see in all the things this BIP is restricting, like going after all of these different arbitrary ways that are not the same as op return, that don't have this is magically a more illegal form of bytes than this other one, like quality, and trying to restrict those too. And at the end of the day, they still fail because I can still make an unspendable UTXO and encode information with that. I can make a bunch of those in a single transaction and encode a very large piece of information across all of those. I can do similar things using BIP16 and reveal that information as I'm spending the coin when I use a hash script instead of like a bare pub key or a bare script. I can literally construct transactions
where the signatures are made in a unconventional way that intentionally allows an observer to derive the private key. So I can put transactions on chain that are intentionally weak in the signature construction, allowing you to get the private key and use chunks of the illegal information as the private keys. Like, you cannot stop somebody who is motivated and willing to pay for the block space from putting arbitrary data on chain. You can just push them into a corner where they use these few ways that it is impossible to stop that are the most damaging and most destructive to the network, bloating the UTXO set, raising storage and validation costs for every node runner. And you're not stopping the information at that point. You are just putting yourself in a position where people using the blockchain to post this information causes the most harm that it possibly could to you, the node runner. Like, the entire starting point and everything built on top of it is just irreparably logically flawed at the foundation.
Even if you're completely against, all these images and all that stuff on the blockchain, I genuinely think it just makes the most sense to say, just put it there where it does the least damage. This argument that it's legally or morally worse to put it in one place or another, I personally don't understand that. I don't think there's any real legal precedent for that either. You always need special software to access it, wherever it is in the transaction. And if you don't do that, don't have that, then as far as lawyers seem to be in consensus on, then you're not doing anything illegal in that sense. And I don't think it makes a difference if it's in an upper turn or anywhere else. And like Shinobi said, other places than upper turn are going to be more damaging. So it's better, I think, to just say, okay, put it in the upper turn. But maybe we should go back to the actual, should we talk about the activation mechanism? Because that's pretty interesting as well.
So this is just really weird, but they have a proactive and a reactive activation mechanism. So the proactive method is essentially just set a block height. And at this block height, this soft fork comes into effect, and all nodes enforcing it will reject any block that activates or that violates the rules after activation. I believe the intended activation time was sometime February next year. And
I just can't even read the part without just laughing at parts.
But then the reactive mechanism is essentially if somebody puts some CSAM on chain between now and the proactive activation block height, we coordinate a minor reorg to orphan that block, and then it instantly activates that rule at the block heights of the orphaned block, so that the next block mined by miners now has to start enforcing it immediately, which is absolutely absurd. And as I've said, this disgusting material has already been put on chain multiple times, once as far back as 11 or 12 years ago, I believe, and even more recently with inscriptions. This has already occurred. I'm flabbergasted.
Yeah, so the proactive method is fairly normal. It's just very rushed. We've within 3 months, and the BIP is not even finalized. So that's extremely rushed. And then the reactive one is just kind of bizarre, because one, it would first of all, so they would want to invalidate a block retroactively if there's CSAM in it, and users should have to do that. So first of all, that means that how do you know that it's even in a transaction? So either you have to blindly trust someone just says it's there, and now all of a sudden we're rolling back the chain, or you have to actively look if it's in there, which in itself, I believe, is illegal. So you have to do something illegal to launch the chain in that sense, right? And then also, so then we're rolling back the chain. And with this activation method, you also introduce a potential attack vector and an incentive to put this stuff in the chain. Because what you could do is you go to the Ferrari dealership, you buy a Ferrari, you pay with Bitcoin, and then in the same block you put some CSAM. And then after 6 blocks or something, you drive out of the car dealership, you tell people, oh, there was CSAM in there. The chain is rolled back, and you get your money back, and you're driving. So now now there's an incentive to put the CSAM in there, and it is a possibility for people to double spend Bitcoin. It's not very well thought out. Is my humble opinion.
But also walk us through exactly how this works. Like, this is similar to people just running knots, right? Like, a bit gets implemented or gets merged into code that other computers are running. Like, unless it gets merged there, this is just a hypothetical conversation still, right? But it's like one step up from where we were, let's say, a week ago.
Yeah.
I mean, details are still being fleshed out, but there's like a couple of ways to do it. Like in the Bitcoin software, you can invalidate a block, and then you sort of you roll back the chain. So that is currently something individual users would have to do. I don't know exactly how they have it in mind or what they want to do, but that's the general concept in a nutshell. You just tell your software, this block, it's not a valid block. We're gonna follow another chain, essentially. Does that make sense?
Okay, and if you would compare it to the idea of filtering before, like the filters never had a chance to ever reach any kind of impact unless they got to 95, 99, 99.5% of everybody running filters, right? But is that the same thing going on here? Do we still only need a couple? Like, what's the difference?
Okay, so that gets into sort of game theory, which is also interesting. So, but I can kind of keep it simple. So, and then let's for a moment forget the reactive approach, but rather the proactive one, which is relatively normal, right? Where we just say, at this block height, we're soft forking. So in that case, if only a minority soft forks, so if only a minority goes along with it, then it would split the chain. So now there's a coin split, everyone gets coins on both sides, and you can trade them with each other. As long as the soft fork chain stays the shortest, that will forever be the case. However, if at any point the soft fork chain overtakes the normal chain, the whatever you want to call it, then because it's a soft fork, then all nodes would actually go along with that. So if the soft fork chain ever becomes longer, then all chains go along with that, unless they also do something about that. So there are ways, you can checkpoint the block. You can, during the activation mechanism, do sort of a counter soft fork where you actually reject signaling blocks. So you can, if people don't want to go along with the soft fork, there are ways to actually force the split, and then you for sure get a split, as long as there's at least some blocks being mined on both sides, right? Like if 100% hash power is on one side, then there's no splits, but as long as there's some, so you can force a split, even if you don't agree with this soft fork, then you can say, I'm not going along with that, and then sort of the chain with the current consensus rules also just stays alive.
If you were to ask me, is a recession coming? The first question should be, is the market going down? This is why the forward guidance is way more important than the actual policy.
I'm Felix, host of the Forward Guidance podcast, and somebody who's wildly obsessed with all things macro and crypto and where the two worlds collide.
Once we looked at the world through this lens of the debasement of fiat currency, we realized there's actually only two assets that outperformed this.
10-year yields went from 360 to 480 in 5 months while the Fed was raising rates. Sorry, Jay Powell, that was a rejection of the policy.
Whether it's Michael Howell breaking down global liquidity or Joseph Wang dissecting monetary policy, we talk to the best and brightest so you can always stay on top of the most important stories driving macro.
You add up tariffs and big beautiful bill, the train has stopped. In fact, it's going in reverse.
A year ago was the first time in 25 years of doing this that every little single thing that I looked at told me to sell.
We cover everything from inflation to interest rates to bonds and Bitcoin and all the biggest forces shaping the global economy. Subscribe to Forward Guidance and stay one step ahead of the next big move.
I mean, I really feel like we should spend some time with the justifications here because they're just so particularly bizarre and like very.
Oh, sure. So we're not going to make sense of them. Nobody's going to make sense of them.
Well, no, because like, again, like I think some of the more fascinating parts of this BIP are essentially like them trying to make the case that this has happened before, like in a very strange way, right? Like, so like, there's this whole kind of part where it's like it argues, is this unprecedented? And then it uses like two pretty clear instances where I think like, it was definitely a very clear emergency where like the actual like chain health and like people's coins were at risk. And again, it's like the burden of proof is like there isn't actually anything being presented like in this BIP that would make the case that this requires the urgency that it actually advocates for. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know who wants to pick out what were their favorite parts, but I can jump in if no one else has one.
I mean, one of the interesting / concerning, if you ask me, parts is that a lot of the BIP relies on sort of, implicit legal threats. There are, or even explicit, more or less, like where they say, if you don't go along with this soft fork, or if miners don't go along with this soft fork, I'm not sure which it is, or both, then you should be aware that you're a legal liability. And if we sort of extract that to what Luke, who his fingerprints are all over this BIP, although he didn't officially author it, but even at the bottom of the bit it said official original draft by Luke Dasher. He in his view, the main chain, or the chain with the current consensus rules, would be like the CSAM chain. That's sort of how he's framing it. So if you don't go along with this, if you don't go along with the soft fork, then you're a pedo, and then you're at risk of being criminally prosecuted. And that's not a technical justification for a any Bitcoin change, of course, but the fact that it's so sprinkled through, or implicit and explicit, that's a new thing. We haven't seen that before, or at least I don't remember seeing that before. I guess the closest thing, as Peter Todd pointed out, is we have seen a BIP that sort of proposed to implement KYC AML on a protocol level or something. That obviously went nowhere, and I never heard from that again. But now we have Luke and a bunch of other more or less prominent people actually pushing for this, using this kind of arguments, which again, it's new.
Well, I think the more interesting thing is the potential precedent this could set in terms of the expiry aspect. Like, that is very much setting a precedent that restrictions like this need to be periodically revisited and maybe updated or changed. Like, something like this, if this was actually adopted and set a precedent like that, that's kind of insane to make the nature of consensus rule restrictions open to like social dialogue and politicking at a regular interval like that. Like, what types of transactions should be restricted and like disallowed? Like, that's insane.
I'm going to read my favorite part here. Just, does this proposal solve spam completely? No. It is impossible to solve spam completely, and typical spam is best fought with policy filters, not consensus. What this does is close the gap for a bad actor miner to mine a malicious block, including contiguous data, that alone could be misinterpreted to be an image. So it doesn't solve the problem.
Am I reading from that sentence that they're confessing that data alone is not an image? And you've given up the argument, right? Like, if there's information you need a third-party software or something to read, and that doesn't constitute enough guilt, let's say, then what's your problem? And then we're done, right? Now they're saying that stuff can be misinterpreted to be an image. Is it or is it not an image? If it's
I'm trying to understand, like, so what does it actually achieve? Like, it's like, what does it actually achieve if it doesn't stop the spam, right? And so this is sort of goes to like, why were the developers against kind of going down this road? Well, it's like the cure is worse than the disease. And then here we have like, this is the cure, right? I mean, you have to basically disable a bunch of like useful stuff that other people have the freedom to use and or abuse, and basically gut the scripting language. I mean, I think the great script castration is like the, one of the nicknames of the BIP that I think makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I don't know. The legal precedent thing here is, sorry.
Yeah, so I can answer your question, and I did. Again, and this is why I say, like, the arguments eventually, like, if you keep, with the arguments and counter arguments every time, with anyone, and that's now been a whole bunch of people that I went through the whole debate tree, you end up in the place where op return is a unique risk. So illegal data in op return is a unique risk compared to illegal data somewhere else. And that is, again, that's just where I have to say, agree to disagree. I don't think there's any moral or legal difference. I don't believe that's the case. But yeah, that's where you end up. So this BIP would sort of, it admits that you can't stop arbitrary data entirely, but at least it can't be in an op return, which is supposedly the unique risk.
Which is nonsense. Like an illegal file is an illegal file. It doesn't matter how you obfuscate it. Like the illegality is in possessing it, distributing.
Yeah, I mean, like, this has been referenced by, there was, an article that was somebody resurfaced the other day, which I thought was, pretty prescient, which is that, during the Blocksize war, someone uploaded a picture of the Tank Man, sort of illegal, Tiananmen Square type image. I don't think I'm getting that 100% right, but, essentially the, banned image in China as a way, to make sort of the Chinese mining, entities at the time face some sort of legal threat. And so, anyone who's been operating and running a node in China has been in possession of that content for, going on 7 years now. I mean, I just think this whole thing is like, you can talk about the technical justifications, but then it's like the burden of proof on somebody has to be like, who is actually being harmed by this today? It's like, where is there any incident that would require this level of justification of emergency? And it's just like, that's where I just can't sympathize with it at all. I mean, even some of it, it's like,
Pete, there is an image of the Prophet Muhammad on chain. Like in some Muslim countries, that can literally get you put to death. Like you can be executed for having something like that.
Well, but is it really though? If it's not in op return data, then maybe it doesn't count.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
Like, and also like there's
illegal content like represents some sort of existential threat to Bitcoin. It's just very bizarre. It's like, where does it come from, and like who is pushing it, and like what is the reason for this activity? And it's just like, that's where I think it gets super problematic. It's like, it's very obvious that like, this is just a justification for what they really want, which is they want to stop users from doing things that they don't like. And so this is just an ipso facto justification of like, this is the best version of this straw man that has existed. And now they're sort of getting people riled up about this idea that you could be legally or morally responsible from hosting certain content, and like the idea that like Bitcoin could be a failure because of that. It's just very bizarre to me. It's like if Bitcoin's goal is to be money, then how can it be a failure because it hosts content?
Yeah, that's the other aspect to it. Is even if we would assume this, in my view, rather bizarre premise that illegal data in op return is a unique risk versus in any other place in a transaction, still then you should ask the question, should technical Bitcoin development take that into account? Or should it based on the merits of the software itself? That is the original cypherpunk perspective, going back to the book I wrote, right? Like that was their philosophy, is that we are built, cypherpunks write code. It should not take into account what the laws of a country is. Like this technology is so powerful that it will spread and that you can't stop it. That is the goal anyways.
Yeah, even the idea that Bitcoin itself isn't and can't be illegal is just absurd. Like the idea that, Satoshi, like, I mean, this seems to have been lost from the recent discussion, but, one of the reasons Satoshi is anonymous is that he feared legal repercussions for issuing and writing Bitcoin. And so the idea that Bitcoin exists with some sort of legal clarity is such a new development that it's just like hard to even take seriously, because it negates like the entire history of like the software development process of Bitcoin even before it. And so you have to then like have this view that Bitcoin is somehow exists in like this pristine moral clarity already, which it clearly doesn't and can't, like definitionally, and therefore, what am I supposed to do with that argument?
Yeah, so I mean, really, Bitcoin should be developed, I think, under the presumption that it's all going to be illegal. Like that's sort of what the software is designed for. Now, then, NOT's proponents will argue back, yeah, but that's for money and not for data, and then you get back into the up return is somehow a unique place in a transaction versus others. So it all roads lead to that, in my experience, always to that. Like in up return, it's uniquely a problem.
That should not be taken seriously or like humored as a line of argumentation at all. It's just absurd nonsense. Like,
the reason that Bitcoin is better money is because it is a data-based money and that you can program in. Like, I mean, that has to be like part of your forward assumptions. Like, if you are a Bitcoin maximalist, like, and so therefore, like, the neutering of Bitcoin scripting merely as a way to stop people from, doing things that you might find embarrassing or unlawful or like whatever, it's just as absurd.
Like you like hit the nail on the head. It is programmable money. Like the original scripting language that Satoshi created, like it had op return, which it didn't actually work the same. It was a way to skip like everything after that in the script and just not evaluate it. Just go to the end of the script and see if what you've executed so far like was a valid output. And it had like all of these functions like push data that are used in everything for pushing arbitrary data onto the stack in a script. It had all of these multiplication and division opcodes and opcat to literally take two pieces of data and glue them together into one piece of data. Like the multiple functions of the language were entirely about manipulating arbitrary data like any other programming language does. And the only reason he took that out was poor design and denial of service risk. Like he didn't take them out because Bitcoin isn't supposed to do these things. He took them out because he fucked up and did it in an insecure way. So turned all of it off until he could come back to figure that out.
Yeah, I think that this is a big thing like that I have, which is like Bitcoin is money because it's useful as money in practice. And like because it is money in practice, it is irrelevant like whether the theory completely matches this. And so I had a long argument in Quebec about this like the other day, where essentially it's sort of become like, well, in theory, Ethereum is supposed to be a world computer. But like in practice, it is not that. Like that is not what people actually use it for. And therefore there's an imbalance. And I think it's fair to critique the system from like what the original intent was in the results. But there's this idea that because Bitcoin is money, like or supposed to be money, that this intent is sort of the thing that matters. And so my counterexample to that is, well, it clearly can't be the intent that really matters. And so if it can't be the intent that really matters, then the theory is sort of secondary. And if the theory is secondary, what matters is that Bitcoin is practically money. And because it's practically money and people use it as money, it is irrelevant what else people may use it for. Because these are just ancillary things that like you can't control or stop. And I don't even understand why you would want to do that. In practice, Bitcoin is money. And so like it's sort of irrelevant. Like a lot of this is policing the definition of Bitcoin as money that doesn't need to be policed. Like because in practice, like Bitcoin will be used in almost the same way that it already is. And again, like the whole debate, I think there's been yet to be, and this, like, again, this is the closest they've come to sort of like, okay, it's like, what is the threat of people using Bitcoin in some way that's theoretically not money? Like, what is the threat, right? This is the best steel man of this threat. Is like maybe someone can put illegal data on your node. But that threat also already exists and has always existed. So like, there isn't anything new to litigate here. But I don't know. I just would draw the distinction of like Bitcoin in practice, right? Like Bitcoin is money in practice. It's irrelevant what Bitcoin wants to be in theory because it is in practice. And, you know, again, it's like if you want to use Bitcoin for other things, there should be some sort of level of like, you know, requirement here, a burden of proof on the people who want to change Bitcoin to suggest that like in some way the node operators like have been harmed by this. And there's literally almost no evidence that's been presented that there's, I continue to maintain that if you were living on some Caribbean island, like using Bitcoin, like you would almost have no understanding that this event ever happened or that there was anything going on with Bitcoin at all. You would maybe notice like a nominal fee rise, but That's about it. And so therefore it's important to have like the boogeyman of illegal content, right? Like this is the whole thing that this BIP is like pushing forward is like it's sort of necessary because like what they've failed to actually provide is some sort of significant reason. They keep threatening that, oh, the nodes will act, like the nodes will act because they don't like it. And I'm like, okay, well, it's like, well, what's the reason that the nodes will act? Well, the nodes are threatened. Okay, well, how are they threatened? Oh, well, it turns out it's like in the same way that they've always been under threat.
They don't like it. They don't want it. You know, that's actually so smart.
I mean, it's relevant what you want, and that's sort of the point. I also think that this is like another interesting side argument where it's like there's this idea that like people currently running nodes have some sort of a priori rights, like to define what Bitcoin is, like simply because they're providing the service, which is a bit bizarre because the whole idea of how miners work is like the assumption is the miners will exit and leave. Right. The idea is that you, an anonymous miner in any jurisdiction, can log on, produce a block, and then go away forever. And the rules enable you to do that anonymously across jurisdiction. Right. So there's this idea that the miners will enter and leave the Bitcoin system, follow the rules, and then depart. But then we're supposed to basically have this higher threshold for node operators, where node operators are what? They're like part of the system forever, and they have some sort of, endemic. This is sort of the immigration argument, right? They have some sort of endemic rights. Because you're running a node, you're like a naturalized citizen. Where it's like, okay, like, and I really would like someone to explain this to me because I haven't been able to get an definition. It's like, why shouldn't we assume that nodes will enter and leave the network, like assuming to whether or not they want to like meet whatever the rule set is? Like, why do they have a higher threshold than miners? And I think like this is another example where this BIP kind of like falls into this trap of sort of like, well, it's like nodes have some sort of special rights, and it's like, okay, well, on what basis do they have special rights?
Well, I'm sympathetic to the nuts argument to the extent that if Satoshi had designed Bitcoin in such a way that it could only be used for monetary transactions, kind of like David Chaum's eCash, which could only work for financial transactions. If Bitcoin had been designed that way, I would be equally excited about it because that's kind of all I care about. So I get that sort of desire, but that's not how it's designed, and now we have to deal with that. And I think harm reduction makes sense.
Well, but that still assumes that like any creative use of Bitcoin in any other way is a problem to be solved. And so like, the reason that I always talk about like Casey Rodarmore's work is like, what does invalidating ordinals like mean? What does it mean to invalidate inscriptions? Well, it's like you have to invalidate the creative work of another individual. And so this also seems like another problematic idea that like is always obfuscated in this is like, well, the nodes have some sort of right to take away something that someone else made that follows the rules, right? It's like pretty inherent in this document to like, because the nodes are threatened by the authorship of this protocol, like the nodes have some ability to respond like on behalf of Bitcoin or sort of claim some sort of,
I just want to be very clear here. It is literally impossible to do anything to stop the ordinals protocol without literally confiscating people's actual Bitcoin. All ordinals is the magic number theory that lets them track that one sat went from this year.
So let's even take inscriptions, right? Like inscriptions like follows the current rule set and it follows the current weighting system for like how transactions are supposed to be priced, right? So it uses the arbitrary data weighing payment method to create a game. And let's just say like, hypothetically, let's just say even if we all agreed on that definition, like, well, what rights to the node operator? Because again, like this is what this BIP is claiming. The BIP is claiming that the node operators have some sort of right. What they're saying is that like we, the node operators, don't want this ability, like the software to meet this function, right? That this person has created, right? It's like they view inscriptions as like a sort of malware running on top of Bitcoin. But the problem with that is that it meets the conditional definition of Bitcoin, right? It's using Bitcoin indistinguishably or almost indistinguishably from like other programs, right? And so, I don't know. I just feel like you get down the slippery slope of like, well, the nodes have some sort of ability to decide what sort of activity occurs on Bitcoin.
But they do.
They do through the consensus right. But it has to be consensus. Like,
no, it doesn't. You can also fork off. You can do what you want.
No, but that's my point. It's like
you can do what you want.
The only say you have in what is allowed or not allowed to happen on Bitcoin is the consensus rules that you choose to enforce. That's it. And those are only meaningful to the degree that you are an economically active participant on the network, like actually signing.
Sure, we've been all over that. But what we're talking about here is the theoretical claims, like all go back to the fact that like the node operators have some ability to claim that like because they are infringed, they get to sort of.
They do, and they can. And I'll tell you exactly what will happen if somebody runs this fork. Like if even a tiny group of people run this fork, the block that it activates in will have the ordinals degens just like bidding like mad dogs to try to inscribe something in that block so they can be like, I'm partially to blame for forking them off the network when they don't accept that block is valid because it violates all the policy rules. That is what will happen.
So Rizzo, go back to your story on what Bitcoin did. Like there used to be these meta narratives about what Bitcoin was in all of these cycles. And then, in the 2021 cycle, we had this Bitcoin Maxi cycle where everybody was on Twitter. We were all there together. We all had a fight together. And now we lost it, right? Like there is no story anymore. That was basically what I got from your conversation with.
Well, there's different cultures like who have different ideas of what Bitcoin is, right? Sure. And then it's the question of like to what extent do they get to define like what the actual software is? And I think like one of the things that's important is that like these cultures, like unlike the early cultures in Bitcoin, which sort of all grew out of this idea that Bitcoin could be infinitely changed, right? So there's kind of a demarcation here. It's like early in Bitcoin, and this is where I sort of agree with like Mechanic and Luke to a little bit of an extent, is like there was all these sort of builders, right, who wanted to do all these things, and then some of them wanted to operate outside of the Bitcoin consensus rules and thus kind of spilled over in other networks. And so it was the rigidity of Bitcoin that sort of repelled them. And so thus we view the rigidity of Bitcoin as good because of that sociological context. If you fast forward to today, like these different groups that have expanded out of the rigid rule set all respect that rule set. Even the ordinals people, right? Like, again, it's like that whole culture isn't advocating for Bitcoin changes. They're not advocating for emergency soft forks. They're not advocating for any of these things. And then sort of the Bitcoin, like, suit culture. So like the Wall Street culture, right? It's like, that's another culture. It's like, I don't think that they're even in many cases like running actual nodes. And so like, does that mean that they're an irrelevant culture? Well, it's like, obviously not. They sort of they command the monoculture in a lot of ways. And so like, there's this idea that like, again, it's like, there's a check and balances amongst the Bitcoin participants, right? Like there's the miners, the developers, and the users. And so like from the floor,
is this the check? Is this the attempt to become relevant again? Like we lost the narrative, let's say, the cypherpunky money stuff.
Yeah, this is all about narrative control.
Is this a way to try to wrestle the control back to, the things that matter from one point of view?
I mean, I think that's sociologically what's driving a lot of the activity. Like, I don't think that if you were to ask like the average person who has knots on their Twitter handle, like if they think that limiting Taproot control box to 257 bytes, constraining an on-chain image is something that they feel they're deeply passionate about. It's like they don't have.
No, but they feel deeply passionate about being relevant and talking about something that's important and fighting a battle that, makes sense. And it's like they don't have battles left to fight because, Saylor is doing the Wall Street one and people are saving over here and nobody is doing the technical stuff that they used to identify with. Like at some level.
Yeah, but now it's sort of, we have to get past that this like cultural division is manifesting into like actual technical arguments. So, but like, what's the actual root of this is that, yes, I believe that it's like one social group wants to have control like of the soft, like that's what's happening is like one social group is looking to, pass a judgment and therefore like, push force on some other group. I mean, I guess the argument could be that like somehow the node operators have been forced to do something, but I don't know, by any definition that I've been able to figure, they've been forced to do something that they've already been doing, and then actually more is expected of them. Which goes back to the thing. It's like where do node runners, like where is this idea happen that like existing node runners have some ability like that is just unique to them and like not even future run node runners, right? Like it's like, what is this current set of people running nodes has some sort of ability to check other people's utility or use of the system itself, right? And so there's a couple examples in this BIP where they actually cite other instances that they believe that this is similar to, and I think that's why I was saying earlier, I think we should talk about them because they're probably the most fascinating. So the first one is they're claiming that this is similar to the inflation bug. So in 2010 there was a bug in Bitcoin that created 80 billion Bitcoin. And what they're saying is that the ability to put, contiguous bytes of arbitrary data in Arbitrum is a similar exploit that has a existential risk to the Bitcoin economy, which I think was ludicrous. And in the second instance that they cite, which I can only figure that they are only citing this because there's so few examples and they needed a secondary example that will be completely fucking insane, which is that, there was a accidental chain split where, basically essentially two forks were created as a result of an update where older versions became incompatible, and they needed to coordinate with miners to retroactively get rid of the chain. But here it says in both cases reorganization was chosen as the preferred method to restore the network cleanly, even while other options are available. And the current crisis has an existential greater magnitude and one where reorganization is required rather than merely preferred.
Dude, this is ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous. I'm not I'm not going to sugarcoat this. This is mostly a bunch of extremely right-wing Americans and Westerners who are just cargo culting the rise of Trump and owning the woke, just pathetically scrambling to try to overlay that perspective or lens onto this space and define themselves as the righteous conservatives and everyone who disagrees with them as the woke liberals, and just have that crusade.
So I want to introduce to this conversation an actual definition of harm. So so this is a lot of what this BIP this attempts to suggest is that within the Bitcoin network, it should be viewed as harm that nodes don't want to store data that they the nodes are sort of compelled to store data that is valid on the network. That's their definition of harm. I would counter with an opposite definition of harm. Harm in the Bitcoin network, in the context of the network, some entity or group that is doing harm is making it possible for someone else or some other group to lose their coins or to have their coins experience some loss of functionality that they otherwise would have expected from the rules that they agree with. And so in this case, BIP 444 is the thing that is introducing the most harm. Even though its claim is that it is trying to reduce the amount of harm on node operators, what it would do is actually enacted is it would force two conditions. One, in which case people might lose access to those coins. There might be even the creation of another network of coins that are spendable and marketable, etc. That is harm. I believe that is harm. And the ability for people to lose functionality of their coins that they otherwise opted into voluntarily, that is also harm. And I think both of those instances of harm are more harmful than nodes storing some amount of arbitrary data of dubiously legal risk merely because they don't want to. And so this is again sort of a thing of what is this BIP introducing? I actually think the novel thing here is that it assumes a definition of harm. And that definition of harm cannot be the highest standard of harm. A chain split has to be, and historically in Bitcoin was viewed as the highest amount of harm. That is why soft forks emerged as the preferred way to upgrade Bitcoin, is because it was viewed as net harmful that a chain split would occur, and thus someone could be in the possibility of losing their coins. And so yes, the solution here that is being proposed under this BIP is more harmful than the harm that is being caused. Therefore, it's an erroneous BIP. It should be thrown out on the basis of what it's. But again, I would actually argue that their definition of harm is very suspicious, and I don't even think meets the definition of harm.
They're basically 51% attacks. That's the harm they're essentially doing. So if you get the reorg, that can be if you didn't upgrade to the UESF, then from your perspective, a reorg happens, and that's why you lost your coins. And it looks identical to a 51% attack, the exact same thing happened. And similarly, if you can't spend your coins because the longest chain is sort of censoring that, and you're on that chain because you didn't upgrade your node, then that is also identical to a 51% in your experience. So that is, one of at least one of the only known sort of ways that participants on the Bitcoin network can harm others, a 51% attack. This is specified in the white paper.
You're still trying to approach this too rationally. Like
I'm going to come back to your point because it actually matters, because your point about politics is, again, it's like, what do we want? We want Bitcoin to be apolitical money. So we don't want there to be politics involved in Bitcoin. But what is the nature of politics? Like, purely definitionally, politics exists when one group exerts their rights over another group. Like that's it. There is no broader definition of government, and there existing two groups, and one group sort of
none of that exists in Bitcoin, Rizzo. I think that's where I may disagree with you, because you keep
I think like
the word right.
In this BIP, that is what they're proposing. Like, they're proposing that one group be allowed to exert their rights over another group, and therefore they are introducing politics like pretty directly like into the software process. Like, it's clear that there's one group that would be advantaged, and then there was one group that would be disadvantaged here.
I mean, you can fork off, right? You can force the split, and then the other nodes can, they can do whatever they want on their minority chain, which, if this goes through, is the most likely scenario. If you ask me, it becomes a minority chain, and most people are not harmed because there's just a minority chain, and some, if not all, people get, the airdrop coins, and you can buy some extra Bitcoin with it if you want. But on a very fundamental level, I do think, and I want to hear what you have to say about Rizzo about this. I do think that every node operator has the right to do with that node whatever they want. They can reject any block they want. They can filter any transaction they want. I'm not saying it's a good idea. I think in many cases it's a really bad idea. But you have the right. You have the right to do it if that's what you have the right to hit yourself on the head with a hammer if you want. You have the right. I just think it's a really bad idea. Do you think that node operators have the right to do whatever they want with their node?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that there isn't an argument against that, but again, it's like it's illogical. It's irrelevant what somebody does with their node if there are no other group of people with the node doing the thing, right? And so then, therefore, you get into the political nature of it, where it is one group versus another group, and then the question is who is doing the most harm, within that context, who's actually proposing the most harm. And so, somebody who's just, I mean, I don't know, what's an extreme example of that? I've always been a proponent of dissenting forks. I've been one of the biggest proponents of Mersha and the real Bitcoin, and the development of dissenting software implementations. I've almost, to the point where I didn't even understand if that was a rational thing that made sense to advocate. I have interjected that into almost every conversation that I've had with every Bitcoin developer, is that you should be able to run your own implementation of Bitcoin that dissents from the broad perspective of what Bitcoin is, provided that implementation, again, here's the difference. When Mersha was rejecting sort of all the blocks that weren't, post Satoshi, right? He wasn't creating harm on other people. He was just choosing not to participate. And that's not what's not happening here.
That was also in his own benefit, because he didn't fork himself off the chain.
Sure, but in the case here of the knots when they were running filters, let's just assume the filters worked. Let's just assume that there was a way for filters to work, and then it would limit the harm of the people running the harm of those filters. Then there would be no reason for them to assert push their perspective on somebody else. The filters would work for them. They would have received the benefit of the filters, and then they would just move along with their lives without having so the thing here is that in order to solve this perceived harm reduction, they need to remove the rights and privileges of other people. That's what they're saying with this BIP. That is in fact the argument that it's making, is that the existing Bitcoin scripting language is too complex and thus confers some sort of negative externality on nodes that they're not willing to bear. Thus the nodes are sort of claiming some ability to override it, in some certain way. That's the claim. That's actually what it's.
But the logic here is already here, no? Because of all that material that's already in blocks way down, the harm has already been done. We're already subject to attack, legally speaking, because that's.
Well, again, I think it's the burden, you have to define harm. And I think, I don't think that historically, to the extent that this has been viewed as harm, it's been mitigated by the block size, and it's mitigated by op return, and it's mitigated by, again, it's these people don't want harm mitigation. That's pretty clear. They just want, they want the activity to stop, right? And in as much as that's possible, and they're willing to do any number of things to achieve that. And so, they become a bit of a hostile group, right? Like if it was possible for them to just,
Can I kind of steel man your position? See if I see what you're saying. I think what you are saying is if filters would work, then that would be a harmful way to go about it. If filters would work, it would be harmful for a majority of users to censor a minority. Is that what you're saying?
No, I mean, if filters just worked and they mitigated the cost of you running a node, then there'd be no reason to pursue some sort of, action that reduced the amount of rights or privileges that other people had. But like they don't work, and so therefore, like that is what they are now doing, is to try to take rights and privileges of other people in order to that cost.
Okay, so Dan, and again, correct me.
During COVID, where like wearing a mask didn't work, so you had to force everybody to like stay in your house. So it's like the masks don't work, and so now they have to force everybody to stay in their house. Otherwise, they're not safe. It's literally
and by
the same.
Okay, and hang on, but your definition of force here is basically harassing developers into not releasing software, harassing other users into not running software. Is that the harm you're seeing? Because that is a harm I'm seeing, like the sort of source of harm of the behavior of people.
That also is a definition of harm. That's why I'm sort of saying, like, I think a constructive way to move forward from this BIP is to say, what is it actually doing? It rests fundamentally on a definition that harm is happening. It's happening to some people, and that it is the most egregious form of harm that has ever happened on Bitcoin. And it is literally comparing those instances to like literal inflation bugs that would like would have wrecked the whole economy of Bitcoin. Like they're literally equating the current harm they're experiencing. And so then the question is like, okay, well, let's just taking that claim at face value. It's like, well, what other theoretical harms could be experienced? And I think like I issued 2 definitions of harm. One was which like, people are unable to access or spend their coins like via coin split. The second one would be people who have opted into sort of technical arrangements to use their coins in a certain way, have that stripped away. Those were 2. And you've now added a third, which is that people who are, writing software and are proposing, merited solutions by their technical group are now being discouraged from offering those solutions, like for fear of like harassment or bullying or like whatever. Like I would argue all 3 instances, you've made a definition of harm that is worse than the harm that is created from even, like again, the nodes storing unwanted data that they don't want, nodes storing illegal data that they don't want.
They don't have to do any of that, of course. Like that's the other side of the equation, right? Like they can filter whatever they want and they can reject whatever blocks they want. But other node operators, they can not filter whatever they don't want to filter, and they can accept whatever like that has to be the other side of that equation.
Yep. Which is why I keep that's why I brought up the whole like projection of like the American right in America right now. Like that's exactly what is culturally happening. And they are just painting themselves as like the righteous people protecting things, like everything else be down, like our freedom, but fuck yours. Like they are literally just playing out the last like 8 years.
But they're not asking for more freedom, right? Like they're not saying like, well, we're going to freely do these things and freely associate. Like them trying to do the filters was them freely associating and trying to get the benefit that they want. But that failed. Like they weren't able to socially coordinate to achieve the benefit they wanted because of the way Bitcoin functions. And so now they're realizing that the only way for them to get that is to sort of, again, limit the rights and privileges of some other group. And again, like this is where it becomes like you have to go back to like what is the actual ordinals, inscriptions, like these defending parties doing. It's you could argue that they're abusing like the system of scripting language that exists to make Bitcoin a better money. Let's just say you would argue that. But because they're abusing it within the system of rules, like, they're not fundamentally asking for any changes to that system. And I would argue that because of that, there's a somewhat limit to their disruption, right? They're not asking for any changes. The equivalent of like, somebody playing a game within the rule system. And like, if you don't want to play their game, like they are achieving like so in contrast to the filters group, they are achieving like their benefits, like within their group, with I would argue like a pretty limited amount of harm to other groups. Of course, the other groups aren't making that claim, in which case you have to examine, okay, like, well, what exactly are they saying? But like, again, like, they are the aggrieved party here. And so, they're now saying that, like, this is what we would want to do because our rights, were eroded by this other group. But yeah, I don't know. I've always found the claim that, like, the node operators in this instance, were in any way, hassled or harmed by, like, the ordinals or inscription folks to be pretty spurious. And that's why you've gravitated towards these other, like, extreme forms of examples where it's like it needs to be illegal content, like, right, it needs to be like banned, like some content that would require legal liability, because unless you evoke that, then there's no reason, you know what I mean, like their claim wasn't taken seriously until they did that. And so Julian Assange has a great quote about politics where it's like politics is just who will push for change and who will resist, right? Like, that's it. There's just politics just behaves in a certain way, and Bitcoin has politics within it. But then when you're analyzing what these groups sort of want, you have to, like, then look at, like, what the arguments that they're saying about, like, what they are claiming their rights and privileges are, and what they're claiming the harm is that is enforced on them, or it could be enforced on them. And so I don't know, that's like how you have to evaluate the BIP. And I just think that, like, there's a real deep objection that I have to the BIP. It's this idea that, like, again, that, like, this meets the definition of harm that they claim, and that claim that harm is as severe as they claim it is. I don't think that should be accepted by rational people.
Yeah, and then there's a fourth form of harm which we have not discussed, and as far as I know, this is unconfirmed. Maybe Shinobi knows more than I do, but tying in with the implicit and somewhat explicit sort of legal threats that you see in the BIP. Rumor on the street, at least, is that there is also, in fact, an effort to pressure mining pools legally by sending, intimidating letters or that sort of stuff. I mean, if you feel the need to go that far to defend Bitcoin for for this reason, at least, or for any reason potentially, that's I
think Pierre said it best on this podcast, where he's like, these people are fudding Bitcoin in order to save Bitcoin. Like, they've developed, like, this need to, like, they have embraced Bitcoin FUD for the benefit of saving Bitcoin, and are now the progenitors of Bitcoin FUD. But I don't know. I think the whole thing is just really sad. I don't know. I just view the whole thing as, like, and just profoundly sad, because, again, like, I don't know. I differ from a lot of people in viewing the fork wars themselves as really sad, and that there was a fissure in the community that, like, really should have never happened, and that, like, the sum of the two groups was not, the worst possible outcome was, like, the fracturing of the group. And I think that, we're headed towards another fracturing, right? And, like, what is the reason, right? People want Bitcoin to be something that it can't definitionally achieve, or that at the very least it's not worth, achieving that definition for, like, the risk that it would entail. And they're going to fork off, and I've seen that as inevitable since this all started, really.
I still think that the outcome of the Blocksize war was pretty good. Like, if people truly want different things, they should have different things. And if that's the conclusion of this, if people truly want different things, then they should have different things again. I think it's better if that doesn't happen, but if people want different things, they should have different things.
Well, what is the difference? Like, at least Bitcoin Cash had some sort of, like, positive, like, marketing message like behind it.
They have nothing. Like, we're legally compliant in this alternate universe where op return is more illegal than anything else. Like,
that's a good question for the three of you guys, because you were all around in 2017 in the Blocksize wars. Some of you in different positions, right? I was watching from the outside. How does it feel compared to that? How does it feel now compared to that?
Yeah, it's starting to feel
this is like the short bus, like, Special Olympics version of
no, it's exactly the same. Like, I always said this, and I said this at the beginning of the ordinals thing too. I was like, this is going to end up in the fork wars, and, like, how do you know? Because it's like, it did the same thing. It, like, became, like, the social topic du jour, and then it, like, kind of went down to nothing. and everybody forgot about it, and then it just like came back again for some stupid reason, and then it went away again. And so there was this like random oscillation during the fork wars of like, you know, people simultaneously like not really caring about it at all, and then it becoming like the center of like all passionate discussion. And I just think that like now we're at like, you know, the third or fourth iteration of that, and it's just, you know, it was exactly the same. It was like the Blocksize wars was like the dumbest conversation that like you didn't want to be a part of, and you're like, why are people still talking about this? And I just followed you around for years up to the point where I think it actually became, you know, about, you know, ultimately it did become about good things, but it's tough, right? Like even in this conversation, like why I've spent so long reading this BIP trying to like make some sense out of it is like you have to really like kind of dig for like, okay, like, well, what's the thing that's like possibly relevant here? Because it isn't like any of the specific technical objections that they're making, which are all sort of nonsense. Even their aspirations like are somewhat nonsensical. So it's like, okay, like how do you in any way like try to contextualize this in a way like makes sense? I think it was that level of hard. I mean, Aaron probably disagrees with me a little bit because he was probably a little bit more strongly like motivated by the technical components. But like, you know, I think it had a similar quality, and so like it's sort of
I think we're inverse. Like for this time around, I didn't take it seriously at all for the last 2 years, but it's only in the recent month or so that I think this is actually going to lead to a split at some point. It is starting to feel very similar, I think.
Yeah, because now they're introducing topical elements that like have to be resolved, you know? So like the idea that like the Bitcoin node operators like have a legal liability for like what content they host, like is like a specific thing that like those people are going to push to fruition. And they're not going to be satisfied until like that is litigated now. And like, again, it's like, what does litigating that require? It's like it's going to require them contacting lawyers and authorities like to make their opinion that this is warranted. And so like it is going to manifest into an actual attack on Bitcoin. Like it is becoming an actual attack on Bitcoin. I don't think it started there. I don't think it necessarily had to go there, but it's there now. And so it seems pretty hard to put that back in the box. Like I think they're just going to keep going down this road until, you know.
Yeah, I mean, if that happens, then in a way it's worse than the Blocksize wars, right? Like at the end of the day, at least there were no, until Greg Wright, I guess, with his shenanigans. But for the most part, it was at least, you know, it was an ugly social media environment and all of that. But it, you know, at least
it's going to resemble more of like the Craig Wright like attack on software developers. Like I think that would be like the worst case scenario here is you end up with some like sort of prolonged, legally funded thing. I mean, this is sort of like, you know, how long does the Ocean Corporation go? Like how many people side with them? Like, do they actually garner any meaningful economic support? Right. Like that's kind of something we don't know right now. But like that this potential has the potential, right? I mean, all these Bitcoin treasury companies are going to have some sort of like legal standard for how to treat like a potential coin split as a result of this. And like the funny part is like, you know, the original claim of the, you know, filter group was that like, you know, the ordinals people were muddying and like ruining the Bitcoin narrative. And it's like, I can't think of any worse way to ruin the Bitcoin narrative than to force all of the companies now that are actively buying Bitcoin and shorting the US dollar to like develop some like complex legal policy on like node operations. I think like that's like clearly like one of the most horrific outcomes that you could have asked for. It's like, okay, you know, the alternative was just letting Udi and those guys like be fun putting pictures in the blockchain. Like that was okay.
It seems harmless in hindsight. Yeah.
Well, it's like that was the alternative is like, you know, they become like, you know, the meme of like Squidward like looking outside his blinds and like, you know, SpongeBob's like outside. It's like, you know, it's like, okay, well it's like all you had to do was like go outside and touch grass like at any point. And like you stayed inside and like just, you know, went insane. You know, I don't know. It's tough, right? Like, I mean, I don't think that like some of the parties involved are super negatively motivated, right? Like, I mean, I do think Luke is providing a lot of good for Bitcoin. I don't think that he's in a good place, like, or that he's doing good for Bitcoin now. You know, I think the mechanics stuff, I mean, mechanics a bit of a latecomer, right? But you know, they seem to have a strong idea that like the users should in all cases define what Bitcoin is, right? And in this case, what's happening is that they're waging a war on the technical consensus. They're saying that users can override the technical consensus of developers to define what Bitcoin is. And I would argue that this was
I agree with that.
you know, you can debate whether that is whether it is desired or desirable in that context. So do you agree that it is? I think I would agree with you that it's
I think in this case it's a really stupid idea, but
so I agree that it's desirable theoretically, but not desirable in this context.
yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Right. Because like in this case, the specific or developer consensus like doesn't really like have any real bearing on like any of the things that are going on. But I think like that's another way like this is actually interesting is like, okay, well, this is the most significant user rebellion against technical consensus since the Blocksize wars. And they're sort of evoking like the past, you know, effort that was, you know, but I guess in the Blocksize wars, those two things were aligned, right? I keep saying that like the UASF was the technical developers aligned with technical consensus and the users aligned with user activation coming together to achieve the same outcome. Now those two groups
not really. Like BIP 148 at the time was also just Luke. Like and Vladimir was sort of maybe helping, but the most Bitcoin core developers were like not in favor of BIP.
I know, but like there was at least a tacit, you know, they were like the U.S. and Britain in like a war. You know, it's like there were two sides that wanted the same outcome, and so they put up with like there was a certain amount of what they were looking to put up with. But like now they're completely come apart, and I think that the idea. That's why I said, like, I think the idea that users can override technical consensus is desirable. Like, you want a Bitcoin network where that is possible. But, like, I think the question is, like, is it warranted in this instance?
Yeah,
like,
for me, that would be a hard no. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, and I think what's going to be lost in this is that, like, you know, that idea of, you know, users being a check on technical development is going to be weakened, like, as a result of it. It's like because they are going to be ineffective at achieving that outcome. And so that, you know, that will be the legacy of this attempt is that, you know, users failed to activate like their desired fork.
Yeah, I mean, if the, you know, bringing up the Blocksize war, if the Blocksize war is any sort of analogy, then if this soft fork fails or they give up, then you could very easily see another attempt coming from sort of that corner of the community, right? And maybe another.
I've maintained since 2017, like we will never see another successful user activated soft fork. Like that was a complete fluke at the right time when this space and Bitcoin was at the right size that you could practically coordinate that like meaningfully between users and economic actors. Like we are never going to see that again.
I don't know. I think the incentive.
I don't know about that either.
At least interesting in that sort of scenario. So I would not count out that possibility. It's probably harder.
What is it that you think is different about Bitcoin in 2025 than in 2016, 17 that makes you say that?
It's too big. Like there is not like, dude, everybody knew each other back then. Even like the complete fucking randos at like the absolute fringes, like had paths and like associates or like people they knew in common, like with people actually building or doing shit in this space. Like it was actually practical to like bridge that in a relatively comprehensive way. Like that's just not fucking happening with how big things have gotten and like how sprawl out.
Yeah, see, I think that's a problematic viewpoint again, because it sort of says that like this is the whole point is that like social coordination in any system is always possible, but then like you have to look at the some like merits of the social coordination. It's sort of irrelevant whether social coordination can occur. Like of course, like it can always occur. Like even in large systems, like it's possible for that to occur. But like I still think that like if you were to accept that Bitcoin is not if Bitcoin is not a purely populist or majoritarian system, this is like really important because I think there's a lot of people on the like not side who think that Bitcoin is a populist thing. I think there are like people like there are certain people who think that Bitcoin is, you know, inherently populism, and it's like the whole motivation of the soft fork design was that a majority of people could get what they want, like while minimal harm was delivered to some minority group who didn't, who didn't opt in. That's like the whole premise. and so like on that basis, it's like the current idea that like this soft fork like achieves in any way like this is anyway similar to like what the soft fork was originally supposed to do, like isn't accurate, because it's a soft fork where some group of people like are using that as a cudgel to like force people into compliance like with their desired rule set. And so that's just the thing here is like, we're always going to have that. Bitcoin's net. That's another fundamental property of Bitcoin that like you could never get rid of. But that doesn't mean that like Bitcoin needs to be fixed, like because it exists like that. Like we don't need to like, I'm not going to like write a bit that says like we need to like have people, be able to like opt out of majority consensus rules in order for Bitcoin to be apolitical. I just think that that's sort of an assumption that I have. But I'm not going to force anybody into that. I would prefer if that didn't happen. But this makes that happen, like pretty obviously.
I mean, that's just what I mean, though. It's like there's only one place this goes: a economically irrelevant and tiny minority fork themselves off from the rest of Bitcoin, and no one else cares. Like, most people who use Bitcoin probably won't even notice or know that it happened, because like they're just the coordination complexity. Like, dude, back then, like the only legal threats during the Blocksize wars were against exchanges who were threatening or like discussing just swapping out and listing like the new forked asset as Bitcoin. And essentially,
does not reflect that in a lot of ways. These people are like your younger self. Like, I mean, you were a participant.
No, but my point is, though, like that was a purely defensive like thing. Like, you are unilaterally as a business trying to coordinate and just swap out two assets on a market and like essentially defraud people. Like that, they're trying to actively coerce people, like major businesses, as random irrational lunatics with like legal threats. Like this is not going anywhere meaningful in terms of coordination. Like during the UASF, major exchanges specifically listed products to let people trade futures for the fork because of pressure from people running the client. Like, actually, like mining pools supported BIP 148. Like F2 pool actively signaled and was behind that. Major like ATM networks, actual meaningful businesses supported that fork. Like, where is that for knots except for Ocean? Like,
It's
where?
I think that will happen. That's just a matter of time. Yeah.
The important thing at the end of the day is what people value, right? Like, if there is a split, then where does the value go? What coins are people buying and selling for the other one? Trading between each other. What coins do people choose to accept? So, to your point that you're predicting that an economic minority would fork off, the key word there is economic, right? It might potentially even be a majority of people that want to go that way that just don't have a lot of Bitcoin. Or, that's also why, popular sentiment on social media or at a conference like that doesn't really mean much. It's very easy to post something on Twitter. It's also very easy to clap for something that sounds good when you're in an audience. But when you have to actually put your own money on the line, you have to actually say, I'm going to sell this coin for that coin because I think that's a better idea. Then you're kind of forced to think about it a lot deeper or lose your money. And I think, given that incentive, I think people are generally better at decision making.
Dude, even Roger Ver didn't just dump all of his Bitcoin.
Right. Yeah.
He kept the majority of his wealth in Bitcoin and just spread it around between Bitcoin Cash and other things. Like, most of the big people, like during that split, did not just dump all of their Bitcoin. They hedged their bets.
And those that didn't, they went broke.
All right, so final thoughts. So let's just hammer it down. Fork. Is there going to be a fork over this or no fork? let's go around the horn.
I don't know if there's going to be a fork now, like this BIP 444. Like, really? I find that somewhat unlikely, but I've reached a point where I feel like this general sentiment is going to lead to a fork one way or the other at some point.
Crazy things can go on longer than you think. I didn't think the treasury companies would live particularly long. They're still around. We probably will have them for a long time. This one might be very similar. Yeah.
I think we're gonna have a fork, but it's going to be just a joke. Like I don't see anybody besides Ocean and a bunch of nodes people aren't even using, and maybe some tiny irrelevant businesses like going along with that. Like, it's just not happening. Like, and what do you think BlackRock would do? Like, where do you think they would place their bet with unilateral decision making and ability to dispose of those assets?
There's an actionable, very clear road forward. You put the legal argument to the lawyers of BlackRock, at Coinbase custody, at all the other major custodians of coins. If they find, or even try it in court, if they find that the CSUM is sufficiently damaging, then yeah, they're all going to fork, right? The economic value is going to go with the other side, right? So then there's a legal test for this entire thing. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, I'm just imagining Larry Fink sort of being briefed on this.
Hey, stranger things,
It's the contiguity. It's the contiguity at the heart of it.
So fork or no fork, Rizzo?
I mean, I've thought this was going to lead to a fork since as soon as Casey wrote the thing, and I looked at it and I was like, oh my god, they're going to fork over this, aren't they? They can't allow it to happen. It's like one of those things where it was like, you watch somebody do it and you're like, oh, can this be allowed? Because it's just so, he did the unspeakable thing. He enabled a set of people who wanted something within a context to get that with a limited infliction on others, and thus set off the chain of events,
You're excited now, Rizzo. You've been waiting for this for years, and now finally, let's go.
Well, as I said, I try to extract something. I just hope people don't lose money. I think that people are going to lose money as a result of this. I think that's pretty sad. I don't think that because some people are trading ordinals, you should adopt a Bitcoin that becomes worthless. I think that's just I don't know how you got from A to B. It just seems like.
Well, some people would lose money, but some people would earn money, right? The fork is also an opportunity.
Right. Yeah. I'm not a pure capitalist like yourself, my friend. I still, I still believe that people should be owed outcomes based on certain things. And I do think that it would be nice if the people who were in Bitcoin early, aren't penalized for that. I think it's sad that the Bitcoin Cash people who were early to Bitcoin, lost a lot of value and hurt their lives substantially. I think that's sad. I don't wish that outcome, right? But it seems like
they chose that outcome, Rizzo. They chose that outcome themselves.
Yeah.
I would prefer no fork, but if people want different things, they should get different things.
As long as
my mom always said, "Stupid is as stupid does."
So what is that? 2.5 of us say fork. Rizzo and Shinobi will say fork. Aaron says no. I said yeah.
No, I said fork. I think there will be a fork. I don't think it's going to be BIP 444, but there will be a fork, I think.
Right.
I think they're too far down. All right. Well, appreciate everyone's perspectives. Of course, this has been a deep dive into BIP 444. You can find it over on GitHub and make the evaluation yourself, as we encourage all Bitcoiners to do their own research. If you want to check out what else is out there in the crypto sphere, you go to blockworks.co. Check out the suite of podcasts, a lot of other things going on in the wider financial space. You can check out some other podcasts there, including Forward Guidance. Felix, always a font of wisdom about how the powers that be are thinking about the largest economy in the world. Make sure you tune into that and check out other great episodes. For now, this has been Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast.